This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real people or real events is purely coincidental.
The throne room of Lareth was not a place of gold and light, but a tomb of polished black marble where the air seemed to freeze in the presence of Kael Dorian. For 20 years, he had ruled with a hand of iron, his heart buried beneath the wars he had fought and the sacrifices he had made. He was a man who had forgotten the sound of his own laughter, a sovereign who measured life in territory and death in necessity. To the world, he was the great emperor, a godlike figure of absolute authority who required no one. But in the silence of his chambers, the crown was a physical ache, a reminder of the sister he lost and the humanity he traded for stability. He had built an empire to hide his grief, creating a fortress of power so vast that no emotion could ever hope to scale its walls, until the doors of his sanctuary opened to admit a shadow from the fringes of his world. She stood before him not with the trembling fear of a condemned prisoner, but with a stillness that felt like a challenge to his existence. Elara Venn was a ghost from the northern wastes, a woman whose family had been erased by his laws. Yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that no chain could break. As the guards forced her to her knees, she did not look at the floor. She looked at him. Her eyes two pools of amber that seemed to see past the emperor's mask and straight into the hollow chest of the man beneath. In that breathless moment, the calculated coldness of Kael's world began to fracture, hit by a warmth he had not felt in decades. He saw the scars on her wrists and the exhaustion in her frame, yet it was her gaze, unflinching and filled with a terrifyingly clear understanding, that made his pulse thrum with a forgotten rhythm. She was the embodiment of everything he had suppressed, and now, in the center of his power, she was the only thing he could not control. Outside the palace walls, the empire was a tinderbox, with his advisors whispering that this woman was the key to securing his legacy, or igniting a revolution. The choice laid before him was a jagged blade, demanding he either execute this silent stranger to prove his loyalty to the crown, or risk every border he had bled to protect for a woman he barely knew. To save the empire was to remain the great emperor, a hollow monument to duty. But to save Elara was to invite a chaos that could tear the kingdom apart. As the moonlight spilled across the marble floor, illuminating the distance between the throne and the prisoner, Kael Dorian realized he was facing the one enemy he could not defeat with a sword. The air grew heavy with the realization that his next word would either preserve a 1,000-year dynasty, or burn it all down for a love that had barely begun to breathe, leaving the world to wonder if a crown is worth the price of a soul that has finally found its mirror. If this story touches your heart, please join our journey by subscribing to the channel. Like this video to help us share this tale of sacrifice, and leave a comment below. Do you believe love can truly save a man lost in power? Kael Dorian did not live in a palace. He lived in a machine of his own making, where every gear was a law and every steam whistle a command. For years, the great emperor had cultivated a silence so profound that even the wind seemed to hold its breath when passing through the arches of Lareth. He woke before the sun, dressing in heavy silks that felt like armor, his movements precise and devoid of joy. To his subjects, he was a statue of silver and stone, a man who had transcended the messy emotions of the common folk to become a vessel of pure, unyielding order. This coldness was not a gift of birth, but a scar earned in the fires of a rebellion that had nearly erased his bloodline. He still remembered the heat of the flames and the small, terrified hand of his sister slipping from his grasp as he reached for the royal seal instead of her. In that moment of choosing the throne over his own flesh, the boy Kael had died, and the emperor had been forged in the cooling ashes. He had decided then that if the world was to be cruel, he would be the cruelest thing in it, ensuring no one would ever hurt him again. Far from the suffocating marble of the capital, Elara Venn had spent her youth learning the language of the earth and the secrets of the wounded. In the frozen valleys of the north, she was the daughter of exiles, a woman who belonged to no nation and claimed no title. Her life was defined by the rhythm of the seasons and the quiet needs of those the Empire had forgotten. She had learned to find beauty in the cracks of the ice, moving through the world like a whisper that no one bothered to hear, content in her invisibility and her small, fragile peace. That peace was shattered when the shadows of rebellion stretched too far, pulling her from her home to be used as a bargaining chip in a game she never wished to play. The rebels saw her as a tool, and the Imperial soldiers saw her as a trophy, but to herself, she remained a soul searching for light. When she was dragged into the presence of the great Emperor, she carried with her the dust of the road and the weight of 1,000 untold stories. She was a tiny point of color in a world of monochrome, a living heartbeat in a hall filled with statues. Kael looked down at her from his elevated seat, his expression a mask of practiced indifference that hid the sudden sharp ache in his chest. He told himself she was merely a political asset, a piece of leverage to be used against the northern insurgents before being discarded. Yet, as he watched the way she held her head high despite her tattered clothes, he felt a strange, unwelcome surge of recognition. She was a mirror reflecting the parts of himself he had tried to bury, and for the first time in 20 years, the Emperor felt the terrifying cold of his own isolation. Kael dismissed the guards with a sharp flick of his wrist, his eyes never leaving the woman who stood so still before him. He wanted to see her break, to witness the familiar crumbling of spirit that usually accompanied those brought before his throne. Instead, he found only a serene defiance that unnerved him more than any blade could. He ordered her to be taken to the highest tower, away from the prying eyes of the court, but under the constant watch of his most loyal sentries. He told himself it was for security, a strategic move to isolate a potential spy. But in the silence of his mind, he knew it was because her presence was a flame he could not quite extinguish. The tower room was a cage of exquisite glass and cold stone, overlooking a kingdom that felt more like a graveyard than a nation. Elara sat by the narrow window, watching the clouds drift over the jagged peaks of Lareth, her heart heavy with the memories of the north. She could feel the weight of the Emperor's gaze even when he was not there, a heavy, suffocating pressure that spoke of centuries of loneliness and unyielding pride. The palace was a masterpiece of order, yet to her eyes it was starving for a single drop of genuine warmth or a moment of unscripted mercy. She realized then that the man on the throne was as much a prisoner as she was, bound by invisible chains of his own making. Days passed in a blur of maps, tax reports, and the endless murmurs of advisors who saw the world as a game of chess. Kael threw himself into his work with a renewed ferocity, hoping to drown out the memory of the amber-eyed woman in the tower. He spoke of borders and battalions, his voice a low thunder that cowed the men around him. Yet his thoughts drifted to the quiet prisoner who had not asked for mercy. He hated the way she looked at him, as if she could see the hollow space where his soul used to reside before he traded it for a crown. She was a threat to the equilibrium he had spent a lifetime building, a crack in the foundation of his absolute control. When he finally visited her, it was under the guise of an interrogation, his shadow stretching long and dark across the floor. He stood in the doorway, a silhouette of power and absolute authority, refusing to step into the circle of light where she sat. He asked her questions about the northern rebels, his voice cold and clinical. But Elara did not answer with the information he sought. Instead, she spoke of the way the light hit the mountains at dusk, her voice a soft melody that seemed to grate against his nerves like a serrated blade. She saw the way his jaw tightened at her words, a tiny fracture in his armor that revealed the wounded boy hiding behind the terrifying mask. Kael's response was a harsh command for silence, his anger flaring not because she was defiant, but because she was observant. He turned on his heel and left the room without another word, the heavy oak door slamming shut with a finality that echoed through the stone corridors. He told himself that he would never visit her again, that she was nothing more than a nuisance to be dealt with when the political winds shifted in his favor. Yet, as he walked back to his empty chambers, the silence of the palace felt louder than it ever had before, and the weight of his crown felt like a leaden burden he could no longer ignore. He was the emperor, but in that moment, he felt like a man wandering lost in a dark, familiar forest. Kael's childhood was a series of echoes, the most painful being the scream of his sister Lyra, as the palace gates closed between them. He had been 12, clutching the royal seal to his chest as his father's voice rang out, demanding he protect the lineage above all else. That day, he learned that love was a liability, a cord that could be used to pull a king from his seat. He spent the next 3 decades replacing blood with ice and tears with ink, becoming a man who could sign a death warrant without a tremor in his hand. The Empire was his only family now. Elara's scars were not just on her skin. They were etched into the very core of her being by a world that had never wanted her. Her parents had been dreamers, exiles who sought a middle ground between the crown and the sword, only to be crushed by both. She had spent her life being passed from one hand to another, a piece of silver to be traded or a burden to be discarded. To the rebels, she was a symbol they could discard. To the Empire, she was a weed in a manicured garden. This rejection had forged a strength that was quiet but unbreakable, a resilience born of having nothing left. One night, unable to sleep, Kael returned to the tower, his boots clicking rhythmically against the stone. He found Elara sitting on the floor, mending her torn sleeve with a needle she had fashioned from a stray piece of wire. She did not stand when he entered, which should have been an executionable offense. Instead, she looked up and asked him if the stars in Lareth were always so cold. Kael wanted to yell, to demand the respect his title commanded, but the words died in his throat. He saw her hands, roughened by work, but moving with a grace that made his own hands feel clumsy. Below the tower, the air in the court was thick with a different kind of tension. The advisors, men with eyes like vultures, watched the emperor's frequent diversions with growing unease. They whispered of the northern ghost who had bewitched the Iron Emperor, worrying that a man who finally felt something might forget how to rule. They reminded him of the treaties, the brewing wars, and the necessity of her eventual execution to appease the southern lords. Every reminder was a stone added to the wall Kael had built around his life. But for the first time, he found the wall was starting to crumble. He stood over her, his presence a towering shadow, and for a fleeting second, he reached out as if to touch the hair falling over her face. He stopped himself just inches away, his fingers curling into a fist as the old fear of vulnerability flared up like a fever. He told her she was a prisoner, nothing more than a ghost in his house, and that she should not expect to see another spring. But as he looked into her amber eyes, he saw not fear, but a profound pity that shattered his pride. He realized then that she wasn't the prisoner. He was. As the northern borders grew more volatile, Kael's advisors pressed for more information, forcing him to keep Elara closer than the isolated tower allowed. He moved her to a small, sun-drenched chamber adjacent to his private study, claiming it was for the sake of efficiency and constant surveillance. In reality, the empty halls of the palace had begun to feel like a desert without the strange, quiet pulse of her life nearby. He told himself it was purely a matter of state security, Yet every time he passed her door, he found himself slowing his pace, listening for the soft sound of her breath or the rustle of her dress against the stone. The days that followed were a torturous exercise in restraint, as Kael attempted to maintain his mask of imperial indifference, while Elara lived just a wall away. She moved through the corridors like a flicker of candlelight, never demanding attention, yet always drawing his eye with her simple, purposeful movements. He would sit at his desk, surrounded by maps of conquest and reports of blood, and find himself distracted by the scent of wild jasmine that seemed to follow her everywhere. She began to fill the empty spaces of his study with life, placing a single hardy wildflower in a glass or straightening the scrolls he had left in disarray. One evening, as a brutal migraine clawed at Kael's temples and the ink on his documents blurred into illegible streaks, he found a small ceramic cup resting on the edge of his mahogany desk. The liquid inside was a pale, honey-colored brew that smelled of mountain herbs and damp earth, a recipe from the northern healers he had once ordered his armies to suppress. His first instinct was to call the guards and accuse her of attempted assassination, his hand hovering over the bell in a fit of paranoid habit. But as he looked at the steam rising in the dim light, he saw her standing in the shadow of the doorway, her expression unreadable. He drank the bitter tea out of a strange, reckless impulse, and within minutes, the throbbing behind his eyes began to recede into a dull, manageable ache. Instead of gratitude, he felt a sharp flash of resentment that she had seen his physical vulnerability and managed to soothe a pain his royal physicians could not touch. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor as he approached her, demanding to know why she would help the man who held her life in his hands. Elara did not flinch or look away, simply stating that a man blinded by pain cannot see the truth of the world he is trying to rule. The tension between them shifted then, no longer just the friction of a captor and his prize, but a heavy electric awareness that made the air between them feel thick. Kael did not send her away that night, allowing her to sit by the hearth while he returned to his maps, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the room. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of the empire felt lighter, balanced by the quiet presence of someone who expected nothing from the emperor, but saw everything in the man. They were two enemies sharing a hearth, bound by a silence that was slowly becoming a bridge instead of a wall. The winter snows began to settle over the spires of Lareth, locking the world in a white silence that mirrored the stillness inside the palace walls. Kael found himself seeking the study more frequently, not for the reports of failing harvests or rising taxes, but for the quiet rustle of Elara's presence. She had taken to sitting in the far corner, her fingers busy with mending or sorting the rare herbs she had requested from the royal gardener. The servants whispered in the kitchens about the emperor's new shadow, wondering why the man of iron had not yet crushed the northern weed that dared to bloom in his sanctum. One afternoon, Kael stood over a sprawling map of the western territories, his brow furrowed as he calculated the cost of another garrison. The weight of his decisions felt like a physical pressure against his heart, a constant reminder of the lives he traded for the illusion of peace. Without a word, Elara moved to his side, her hand hovering just inches above the parchment where a small river cut through the mountains. She didn't offer military advice or political insight. She simply pointed to a cluster of villages, marked for demolition to make way for the new fort. Her silence was a mirror, held up to his own conscience. He felt the heat radiating from her body, a stark contrast to the drafty halls that usually smelled of old paper and cold ash. Kael turned to face her, intending to remind her of her place and the necessity of his harshness. But the words died as he saw the sadness in her eyes. It wasn't a judgment of his power, but a mourning for the humanity he had sacrificed to maintain it. He found himself unable to pull away, the proximity between them vibrating with a tension that was both terrifying and intoxicating. For a moment, the Emperor was gone, leaving only a tired man standing on a precipice. To cover his sudden vulnerability, Kael reached out and adjusted the heavy shawl that had slipped from her shoulders, his fingers grazing the skin of her neck. The touch was brief, a mere second of contact, but it felt like a thunderclap in the silent room. He told himself it was an act of cold pragmatism, ensuring his captive remained healthy for future negotiations, but his racing heart betrayed the lie. Elara didn't pull away. She leaned into the small gesture of care, her breath hitching in a way that made Kael's world tilt on its axis. The fortress he had built was failing, one small interaction at a time. Later that night, Kael sat alone in the dark, the scent of her jasmine still clinging to his robes like a haunting memory. He realized that the danger she posed wasn't to the borders of his empire, but to the borders of his own soul. He had spent decades ensuring no one could reach him, yet this woman had walked through his defenses without ever raising a weapon. The realization brought a cold dread that rivaled the winter outside, because he knew that once a heart is touched, it can never be truly hard again. The question was whether she would break him, or the world would. The routine of the palace had shifted into a strange, rhythmic dance that the courtiers observed with bated breath and whispered suspicions. No longer was Elara confined to the sun-drenched chamber alone. As Kael began to demand her presence during his late-night sessions of governance and strategy. He sat at the head of the long oak table, his eyes tracing the lines of distant territories, while she occupied a stool near the hearth, her hands busy with needlework. The guards who stood at the heavy doors noticed the way the Emperor's voice softened when he spoke to her, losing its usual jagged edge and cold, metallic ring. One evening, a violent storm lashed against the high windows of the study, the thunder echoing like the ghost of 1,000 cannons. Kael had fallen into a shallow, fitful sleep in his chair, his head tilted back and his hand still resting on a map of the northern provinces. Elara stood and walked toward him, her movements as fluid and silent as the shadows dancing on the stone walls. She watched the way his brow furrowed even in rest, the lines of exhaustion etched deep into his skin by the burden of a crown he never truly chose. He looked younger, more human, and profoundly alone. Kael awoke to find the weight of a heavy wool blanket draped over his shoulders, its warmth a sudden and shocking intrusion into his cold reality. He saw Elara returning to her seat, her back to him, as if the act of care were a mere afterthought rather than a revolution. He should have felt violated by her proximity, yet he felt a terrifying sense of safety that made his skin prickle with heat. He reached up to touch the fabric, realizing that for the first time in his life, someone had cared for the man instead of the monarch. The realization was a jagged blade. Days later, Kael made a decision that sent ripples of shock through the imperial court, ordering the removal of the permanent guards from Elara's door. He gave her permission to visit the long-neglected courtyard, where the palace's old gardens had withered into a tangle of thorns and gray ash. He watched from his balcony as she knelt in the dirt, her fingers gently clearing away the debris to make room for the northern seeds she had carried. To see the great emperor's prisoner tilling his soil was an image of such quiet power that it made the surrounding stone walls seem flimsy and temporary. As the first green shoots began to peek through the frost-bitten earth, Kael felt a tightening in his chest that he could not name. He found himself standing in the garden more often, watching the way her hair caught the pale winter light and the way she hummed to the plants. It was a domesticity that felt like a foreign language, one he was beginning to understand with a desperate, hungry heart. However, the whispers of the council were growing louder, demanding he use her to end the northern rebellion or end her life to preserve his dignity. the peace was a beautiful, fragile lie. One crisp afternoon, Kael did something that defied all imperial protocol. He stepped off his marble balcony and into the garden's dirt. The soldiers at the perimeter stiffened, their spears casting long shadows, but they did not move. He approached Elara where she knelt among the reviving stems, her hands stained with the dark, rich soil of his ancestors. For a long time, he simply stood there, a towering figure in velvet and silver, watching her breathe life back into a place he had let die. He realized then that he had governed this land with law, but she was ruling it with care. Elara did not look up immediately, her focus remaining on a fragile sprout that seemed to struggle against the lingering frost. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a weight that made Kael feel like the prisoner instead of the king. She told him that even the hardest stone could be split by a seed if the seed was patient enough to grow. Kael felt a sharp pang in his chest, wondering if she was talking about the garden or the wall he had built around his heart. He wanted to walk away, to return to the safety of his cold throne, but his feet felt rooted. He reached down, his large, scarred hand hovering near hers as she worked the earth. For the first time, he didn't care about the stains on his expensive sleeves or the judgment of the guards watching from the battlements. He helped her move a heavy stone that had been obstructing the path of a growing vine, their fingers brushing against the cold surface of the rock. The touch was brief, yet it resonated through him like a bell, shattering the last remnants of his icy composure. In that silent garden, the Emperor was just a man, and the prisoner was the only one who truly saw him. Elara watched him, noticing the way the harsh lines around his eyes softened when he thought no one was looking. She saw the ghost of the boy who had lost everything, the one who carried the weight of a sister's memory like a shroud. She didn't offer words of comfort, for she knew that words were often just empty vessels in the halls of power. Instead, she offered her presence, a steady and unwavering light in the darkness of his isolated life. She understood that his cruelty was merely a shield, a desperate attempt to protect himself from a world that had already taken so much. But the peace they found in the dirt and the silence was a stolen treasure, and the world was coming to reclaim it. High above in the council chambers, the lords of the southern provinces were gathering, their faces grim and their hearts filled with ambition. They saw the Emperor's distraction as a weakness to be exploited, a crack in the iron mask that could lead to their own rise. They began to draft the formal demand for Elara's head, a political necessity to secure the borders and prove Kael's devotion to the crown. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was at the gate. The Council of Lords finally struck, presenting Kael with a formal petition sealed in blood-red wax. It was not a suggestion, but a collective ultimatum from the most powerful families in the empire, demanding the immediate execution of the northern prisoner to appease the restless border lords. Kael sat at the head of the obsidian table, the paper feeling like lead in his hands as he stared at the signatures of men he had once considered loyal dogs. The air in the room was thick with the scent of old parchment and betrayal, a suffocating reminder that his absolute power was a fragile illusion maintained only by his perceived ruthlessness. Every word in that document was a ghost clawing at Kael's throat, dragging up the memory of the night he had chosen the royal seal over his sister's hand. He could still hear Lyra's scream echoing through the decades, a haunting melody that reminded him of the cost of duty. Now, the cycle was repeating, and the universe was demanding another sacrifice to keep the crown upon his head. He looked at the heavy gold ring on his finger, symbols of a lineage that had demanded every drop of his blood, and felt a sudden, violent urge to tear it all down. But an emperor does not have the luxury of burning his world. Elara felt the change before a single word was spoken. the air in the palace turning sharp and brittle like thin ice. When Kael entered the study that evening, he did not look at her, his eyes fixed on the distant shadows in the corner of the room. The silence between them, which had once become a sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield littered with unspoken truths and heavy fears. She saw the way his shoulders were hunched under the weight of his velvet robes, a man being crushed by the very throne he had spent a lifetime defending. She knew the hounds were closing in. Lord Venn, the eldest of the advisors, cornered Kael in the private gallery, his voice a low hiss of calculated poison. He reminded the emperor that the people did not want a man who felt. They wanted a god who ruled without hesitation. If Kael refused to sign the execution warrant, the southern provinces would secede, and the rebellion in the north would find a reason to unify against a weakened crown. Venn's eyes were cold, reflecting the same pitiless logic that Kael had used to build his reign. A mirror image of the monster the world expected him to be, until his breath finally stopped. That night, Kael stood by the window, watching the moonlight dance on the garden Elara had painstakingly brought back to life. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he was terrified of losing her, not just as a presence, but as the only part of him that was still alive. The thought of her blood on the very marble she had walked upon made his stomach churn with a sickness that no medicine could cure. He was trapped in a cage of his own design, surrounded by a vast empire that felt more like a desert every passing second. The great emperor was losing his grip. Kael walked the halls like a specter, his presence no longer a source of order but a cloud of impending thunder. Every step he took toward the council chamber felt like a betrayal of the quiet moments shared in the garden. He could feel the eyes of his ancestors watching from their portraits, their cold stares demanding he choose the legacy over the woman. The paperwork for the execution lay on his desk, a white ghost that seemed to glow in the dark. He found himself avoiding the study, terrified that if he looked into Elara's eyes, he would lose the will to be the heartless king his empire required. When he finally entered the room where Elara sat, the air was heavy with the scent of dried lavender and the metallic tang of his own fear. She was braiding her hair, a simple act of grace that made the surrounding opulence look vulgar and unnecessary. He wanted to scream at her to run, to save herself from the machine he had spent 20 years oiling with blood. Instead, he stood by the fireplace, the orange glow casting long, dancing shadows across his face. He spoke of the weather and the coming harvest, his voice a brittle mask that threatened to shatter with every syllable he uttered in her presence. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the fragile silence, and a young page entered with a message that made Kael's blood run cold. The southern lords were no longer waiting for his signature. They had begun to move their private militias toward the capital as a show of force. The message was clear. Either the prisoner died tomorrow at dawn, or the city would burn by sunset. Kael dismissed the boy with a snarl, his hand crushing the parchment until the ink stained his palm like a fresh bruise. The world was shrinking, closing in on the two of them until there was nowhere left to hide from the inevitable. Elara stood and walked toward him, her footsteps sounding like the beating of a heart in the quiet room. She didn't ask what the message said, for she had lived her whole life reading the language of disaster on the faces of powerful men. She reached out, her fingers hovering near his trembling hand, offering a comfort she knew he was too proud to accept. For a moment she was the only real thing in a palace built on lies and ancient grudges. She whispered that a crown was a heavy thing to carry alone, and that she didn't want to be the reason his empire fell to the wolves. Kael turned to her, his eyes wild with a mixture of agony and a sudden, desperate resolve that he had never felt before. He grabbed her shoulders, not with violence, but with the frantic grip of a drowning man reaching for a lifeline in a storm. He told her that the empire was nothing but stone and dust if he had to spend the rest of his life wandering its halls in total silence. The choice was no longer about politics or borders. It was about whether he could live with the ghost of another woman he had failed to save. As the bells tolled, Kael knew his time had finally run out. The ink on the execution warrant seemed to bleed into the very grain of the mahogany desk, a dark stain that Kael could not stop staring at. Outside, the night was a vast, indifferent ocean of shadows, but inside his chest, a storm was raging with a violence he had never known. He was the great emperor, a man whose word could move mountains and erase cities. Yet he felt as powerless as a child standing before a rising tide. The silence of the palace, once his greatest ally, now felt like a predatory beast waiting for him to make a single mistake that would end his reign. Lord Vane's warnings echoed in his mind like the tolling of a funeral bell, reminding him that the southern lords were not men of mercy. They were vultures circling a dying beast, waiting for any sign of hesitation to tear the crown from his head and the life from his body. If he spared Elara, he would be declaring war on his own people, turning his glorious empire into a scorched battlefield for the sake of a northern ghost. He paced the length of his study, the heavy silk of his robes whispering against the stone, a sound that seemed to mock the crushing weight of his duty. He sought her out in the small hours of the morning, finding her by the window where she was watching the first gray light touch the horizon. He wanted to be angry, to find some reason to hate her, so that the coming dawn would be easier to bear. He spoke of treason and the laws of the land, his voice a jagged edge of ice that cut through the warmth of the room. He told her she was a curse, a plague that had infected his mind and weakened his resolve. But his eyes told a different story. He was a man begging for a way out of a nightmare. Elara turned to him, the pale light of morning catching the amber in her eyes and making her look like a saint carved from mountain stone. She did not argue with his harsh words or plead for the life he was about to take. She simply walked toward him until she was close enough to feel the heat of his rage. She reached out and touched the gold embroidery on his chest, her hand steady while his entire world was trembling with fear. She whispered that she had already forgiven him, for she knew that the man who signed the paper was not the man standing before her now. Her forgiveness was a blow more devastating than any assassin's blade, shattering the last of Kael's defenses and leaving him raw and exposed. He realized then that he could not kill her, not because he was weak, but because she was the only part of his life that was actually real. The empire was a shadow, a collection of borders and taxes. But the woman in front of him was his soul returned from the dead. As the sun began to peek over the distant peaks, signaling the start of the day she was meant to die, Kael Dorian made a silent, terrifying vow to the shadows. The dawn was a cruel, bleeding red as it spilled over the spires of the capital, signaling the hour that would define a dynasty. Kael stood before his mirror, his attendants fastening the heavy ceremonial armor that felt like a leaden shroud. Every clink of metal was a heartbeat, a reminder of the document he had yet to sign but the world expected to see. The courtyard was filling with the dark shapes of the southern lords, their banners snapping in the wind like the wings of scavengers. He could feel their collective hunger for blood and their desperate need for a sign of his absolute, unyielding power. In the cold cells below the palace, Elara watched the light filter through the high, barred windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She did not fear the edge of the axe or the darkness of the grave. She feared the look in Kael's eyes when he finally had to say goodbye. The connection they had forged in the garden felt like a lifetime ago, a fragile dream that the reality of the crown was now systematically crushing. She sat with her hands folded, a picture of silent grace that made the iron bars around her look like nothing more than temporary, meaningless illusions. Kael marched into the council chamber, his cape billowing behind him like a storm cloud. The air was thick with the scent of unlit torches, and the sour breath of men who traded lives for land. Lord Vane stood at the front, holding the execution warrant out like a holy relic, his face a mask of feigned concern and hidden malice. The lords whispered, their voices a low hiss that filled the vaulted room with a poisonous pressure. They demanded a public display of his loyalty to the Empire, reminding him that a single moment of hesitation would be seen as a total surrender to the Northern Rebellion. He looked at the paper, the ink seeming to pulse with a dark, malevolent life of its own. He could see Elara's face in the empty white spaces of the parchment, her amber eyes watching him with a calm that made his own soul scream. To save her would be to ignite a civil war that would burn his nation to the ground, killing thousands of innocent people in the process. To kill her would be to finally extinguish the last flame of humanity that remained within his chest. He felt the eyes of the lords drilling into him, waiting for the Emperor of Iron to prove his legendary heartless nature. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors burst open, and a mud-spattered messenger fell to his knees, his voice cracking with panic. The southern militias had crossed the great river, seizing the primary grain stores and declaring that the emperor was no longer fit to wear the crown. The threat was no longer a political shadow. It was a physical hammer falling upon the gates of the capital. Kael realized that the execution was not intended to appease the lords, but to provoke a reaction that would justify his immediate removal. The world was burning, and the time for choosing between the Empire and his heart had finally, violently arrived. The sound of the messenger's voice was like a heavy stone hitting glass, shattering the fragile order Kael had sacrificed everything to maintain. He looked at the lords who had stood at his side for decades, seeing the naked greed reflected in their cold, calculating eyes. They did not want a strong empire. They wanted a puppet they could control with the threat of blood and the promise of land. The realization that his life's work was a house of cards built on the suffering of others hit him with the force of a physical blow, making the heavy crown feel like a band of fire around his head. He did not wait for the lords to finish their accusations, or for Lord Vane to offer a hollow apology for the coming storm. Kael turned and walked out of the room, his long cape sweeping the marble floor as he moved toward the dark heart of the palace. He ignored the shouts of his generals and the frantic questions of his staff, his only focus being the woman who sat in a cold cell waiting for a death he was no longer willing to give. The Empire was screaming for his attention, but for the first time in 40 years, the great Emperor was listening to a different, much quieter voice. When he reached the iron bars of her cell, he did not look like a god or a king. He looked like a man who had lost his way in a familiar forest. He dismissed the guards with a snarl that left no room for argument, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the heavy brass keys. The door groaned on its hinges, a sound that felt like the earth itself was protesting the sudden shift in destiny. Elara stood as he entered, her face illuminated by a single torch that cast flickering shadows against the weeping stone walls. She saw the truth written in the lines of his face. He told her that the world outside was burning, and that the men he called brothers had turned their swords toward his throat in the name of a false peace. He spoke of the sister he had lost to the same ambition, the words tumbling out of him like a confession he had been holding back since he was a child. He realized that saving the Empire would mean losing the only thing that made him feel alive, a bargain that now seemed impossible to make. He was standing on the edge of a great abyss, with his crown in one hand and her life in the other. Elara reached out and took his hands, her touch the only steady thing in a palace that was vibrating with the rhythm of an approaching army. She did not ask him to be a hero, or to throw away his duty for a love that had barely begun to bloom. She asked him to be the man she had seen in the garden, the one who knew how to nurture life from the frozen, unforgiving ground. The weight of his choice was a jagged blade in his chest, knowing that to choose her was to watch his history disappear. He pulled her close, the silence between them a final sanctuary. The roar of the mob outside the palace gates was a sound Kael had heard in his nightmares since the day his sister died. It was the sound of a world hungry for the blood of those who dared to sit above it, a primal scream that tore through the refined silence of the marble halls. From the depths of the dungeon, the vibrations of the battering rams felt like the pulse of an angry god, shaking the very foundations of the empire. Kael stood in the cell, his body shielded by the shadow of the door, feeling the weight of the crown pressing down on his brow like a band of thorns. The distance between the throne and the grave had never felt so small, and the woman before him was the only reason he still chose to stand. The heavy iron doors at the top of the stairs groaned open, and Lord Venn descended into the dim light, followed by a phalanx of the Imperial Guard, whose loyalty now hung by a thread. The old man's face was twisted with a mixture of fear and triumph, his eyes reflecting the flickering torchlight like a serpent waiting for its prey to weaken. He demanded the prisoner be brought to the balcony at once, claiming that only her public execution could sate the fury of the lords and stop the siege from turning into a massacre. Venn spoke of the thousands of lives that would be lost if Kael continued this madness, placing the blood of a nation squarely on the Emperor's shoulders. Kael felt the cold logic of the Empire trying to reclaim him, whispering that the life of one woman was a small price to pay for the survival of the crown. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had signed the treaties that had ended wars and the warrants that had ended lives. For 20 years, he had been the ultimate architect of order, believing that the greater good was worth any personal sacrifice he had to make. But as he looked at Elara, he realized that the greater good was just a mask for his own cowardice and his inability to face the emptiness of his own existence. He was being asked to trade his soul for a pile of rubble and a title of ash. Elara stepped forward into the circle of light, her gaze moving from the trembling emperor to the cold, calculating eyes of the man who wanted her dead. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like the only person in the room who was truly free. She touched Kael's arm, her fingers grazing the heavy silk of his sleeve, and whispered that she was ready to go if it would save the people from the fire. She offered herself as a sacrifice not out of love for the Empire, but out of a profound compassion for the man who was drowning in its expectations. Her willingness to die for him was a rupture that tore through Kael's heart more violently than any blade. The Emperor let out a sound that was half sob and half growl, a raw release of the agony he had kept buried for decades under layers of silver and stone. He turned to Venn and the guards, his eyes burning with a terrifying, desperate light that made even the seasoned soldiers take a step back in shock. He told them that if the Empire required the blood of an innocent to survive, then the Empire had already died a long time ago. With a violent motion, he drew his ceremonial sword, the blade singing in the damp air of the dungeon, and stood between the world and the woman he had finally learned to see. The rupture was complete. He was no longer their king. The blade in Kael's hand was no longer a symbol of office, but a tool of desperate protection, its edge gleaming in the torchlight of the dungeon. He stood before Elara like a mountain shield, his breath coming in ragged, heavy bursts as he faced the men who had been his shadows for years. In this moment, the vast maps and the cold tax reports meant nothing compared to the warmth of the living soul behind him. He felt the heavy weight of his crown, not as a burden of duty, but as a chain he was finally ready to break. The Emperor was gone, and only the man remained, ready to burn his own world for a single truth. Lord Venn's face turned a sickly shade of gray as he watched the Iron Emperor tremble with a rage that was purely, dangerously human. The guards hesitated, their spears wavering as they looked between the man they feared and the lords who promised them security and gold. The air in the corridor was thick with the scent of ozone and the distant muffled sound of the palace gates finally giving way to the sea of the angry mob. It was the sound of an era ending, a crashing wave of history that cared nothing for the names of kings or the beauty of silent prisoners. The betrayal was now complete. Kael turned his head slightly, looking at Elara through the haze of his own tears, his voice a low, broken whisper that barely carried over the rising noise. He told her about the night he had let go of his sister's hand, the night he had chosen the cold silver of the seal over the warmth of his own blood. For 20 years, he had been trying to build a wall tall enough to hide that shame, only to realize that he had built a tomb for himself instead. He looked into her amber eyes and promised that he would not let the darkness take her too, even if it meant losing everything else. With a sudden, decisive motion, Kael reached up and tore the heavy gold circlet from his brow, the metal clattering against the stone floor with a hollow final sound. The lords gasped at the sacrilege, for an emperor without his crown was nothing more than a man walking toward a certain death. He did not care about the titles or the territories anymore. They were just ghosts of a life he was finally leaving behind in the shadows. He took Elara's hand, his grip firm and steady for the first time in decades, and felt a surge of terrifying, exhilarating freedom. The choice was made, and there was no turning back now. The walls of the palace shook as the front doors were breached, the roar of the crowd flooding the upper halls like a physical force of nature. Kael knew the secret passages that his ancestors had built for escape, routes designed for cowards that he would now use to save the only thing that mattered. He pulled Elara toward the hidden door in the stonework, leaving the confused guards and the shouting Venn behind in the gathering dark. As they stepped into the narrow, cold tunnels beneath the city, he realized that he was no longer saving an empire, but he was finally, truly saving himself. The world was ending, but they were breathing. They moved through the damp shadows of the earth, the stone walls pressing in like the memories of a life Kael was finally leaving behind. Every step away from the throne room was a heartbeat closer to the man he had forgotten how to be. He held Elara's hand with a desperate strength, as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the world. The silence of the tunnels was a stark contrast to the chaos screaming above, a hollow echo of the 20 years he had spent living in a tomb of his own design. He was no longer a sovereign. When they finally emerged into the biting winter air, the sky was stained a bruised purple by the fires of the capital. Kael looked back at the sprawling silhouette of his palace, a monument to his pride that was now being consumed by the very people he had tried to control. He felt no grief for the marble or the gold, only a strange and terrifying lightness in his chest. The empire was a memory of ash and smoke, a heavy shroud he had finally cast aside. He turned his back on the burning city, facing the dark, uncertain horizon with a woman by his side. They found shelter in a small, abandoned shepherd's hut, nestled in the foothills of the northern mountains. As Kael built a small fire to ward off the freezing dampness, he watched Elara resting against the rough wooden wall. For the first time, he saw her not as a prisoner or a political pawn, but as the woman who had dared to look into his hollow soul and stay. He realized that his true power had never been in the armies he commanded or the laws he signed. His power was in the choice he had made to be human again in the cold. Kael removed his heavy, stained velvet cloak and wrapped it around Elara's shoulders, his movements gentle in a way the great emperor would have never understood. He sat beside her, his large, scarred hand shielding her from the draft that whistled through the cracks in the boards. He was a man trained for war and conquest, yet his only focus now was the steady rise and fall of her breath. He would fight the world to keep this small circle of warmth alive, knowing that he had traded 1,000 miles of territory for a single moment of genuine peace and shared silence. He spoke her name in the quiet of the night, the sound of it feeling new and sacred on his tongue. There was no command in his voice, no cold authority, only a vulnerability that felt like a prayer. Elara looked at him, and in the flickering orange light of the embers, she saw the boy who had once let go of his sister, and the man who would never let go again. They were two outcasts in a world that had forgotten them. But as they shared the silence of the mountain, Kael knew he had finally found his home. As the first light of a new world crept through the gaps of the hut, Kael did not wake to the sound of trumpets or the heavy footsteps of guards. He woke to the soft, rhythmic breathing of Elara, whose head rested against his shoulder in a gesture of absolute, terrifying trust. He looked at his hands, no longer stained by the cold ink of execution warrants, but roughened by the wood he had gathered to keep her warm. The empire of Lareth was a distant, smoldering memory, a ghost of stone and blood that no longer held any power over his heart. In this small, humble space, he felt more substantial than he ever had while sitting upon a throne of obsidian and lies. The transition from a god-king to a common man was not a fall, but a slow, agonizing ascent into the light of the living. Kael realized that the crown had not been a symbol of his strength, but a mask for his profound and crushing loneliness. By choosing Elara, he had not only saved her life, he had reclaimed the boy who had once stood in the fire and survived. The iron that had once encased his heart had finally melted away, leaving behind a man who was capable of feeling the bite of the wind and the softness of a touch. He was stripped of his titles and his territories, yet he felt richer than any sovereign who had ever drawn breath. Elara opened her eyes, finding him watching her with a gaze that was no longer guarded by the walls of a palace. She saw the lines of pain on his face, the marks of a man who had walked through hell to reach her side. She didn't need to ask if he regretted the loss of his vast kingdom, for the answer was written in the way he held her hand, not as a possession, but as a lifeline. She rose and began to gather the few supplies they had, her movements steady and filled with a quiet, north-born resilience. She was no longer a prisoner of his empire, but the guide who would lead him into a future where names were whispered in love, not shouted in fear. They stepped out into the crisp, white silence of the mountains, leaving the burning past behind them like a discarded skin. Kael looked one last time at the valley where Lareth lay, seeing the smoke rising from the ruins of a life he had once thought was eternal. He understood now that an empire is only as strong as the compassion of its ruler, and he had been a man building a fortress out of sand. His choice had been cruel to the history books and the maps, but it had been the only mercy he had ever shown himself. He had traded a world of stone for a heart of flesh, and for the first time in 40 years, he did not regret the price. The path ahead was steep and covered in fresh snow, leading toward the northern peaks where the air was clean and the laws of emperors held no weight. Kael took a step forward, his boots sinking into the white powder, and felt the weight of Elara's hand firmly in his. They were walking away from greatness and into the quiet obscurity of a life lived for each other, a destiny that no poet would write and no soldier would defend. As the sun rose high over the jagged ridges, illuminating their path, Kael Dorian finally let go of the Emperor's shadow. He breathed in the cold, sweet air of freedom, knowing that his greatest victory was not a war won, but a love that had finally allowed him to come home.